first real look-see into the Project Mercury and what lies beyond. At one point, he stood aside and was chatting informally with one of the astronauts who was on hand rather conveniently to show him the marvels of the space age. And he remarked aloud that he marveled, first of all, that anyone could get into that capsule. And we recall some of his joking with John Glenn when the astronaut was here in Washington about some of the things that he had seen from space. And once at the Cape, he was overheard to remark that had things been a little bit different with him, he too might have liked to make a trip into space. So he was a pioneer in that sense. He wanted to do new things. He was constantly reading, and he was most interested in all of the technical aspects of how you get into space, how you get back, and what is the best, the latest and best for the military. President Johnson presumably will make no major changes either in the military or space, except that he may be expected to continue to pound hard to keep the United States ahead or to push it ahead in various aspects of space. He has been the head of the President's Space Council. He's been kept informed of all of the technical developments. He is a booster of this effort and is expected to go along in that general trend. One Pentagon man, when I called over there today, was in I won't say a state of shock, but rather broken up. He said the death of Mr. Kennedy won't stop anything here. We'll carry on where he left off. The military officers, traditionally, the Army is in charge of state funerals where the military is involved. A number of those people are at the White House at this moment discussing the various possibilities should a military funeral or anything having to do with Arlington be on the agenda. Whether or not they will be involved, there will surely be a funeral cortege of one kind or another through at least part of Washington. It has been a tradition that the military caissons, the horses, the smartly dressed ceremonial troops take part, and they are ready, I'm told, at this moment to do whatever they can, whatever they're called upon to do. There was one officer in this general area with whom I spoke, the same age as the President, and as he put it to me, it was like this: it's almost too difficult to think that we'll be doing this sad duty. This is Peter Hackus, NBC News, Washington.
What has happened is numbing. There are, I think, few people who can understand it, who can appreciate the fact that Mr. Kennedy is in fact dead. It comes as a tremendous shock and does numb. I think perhaps our ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, has summed it up with this statement. The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours, and all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer, prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. May God help us. The words of Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, spoken this afternoon at the United Nations. Frank?
As this chaotic situation continues, more and more pieces of the story begin to fall into place, and some of the reports that we brought you in fragmentary form earlier are being clarified. It is now apparent that no Secret Service men were injured in the attack on President Kennedy. A top Treasury official said today that Robert A. Wallace, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, under which the Secret Service operates, said the service had received a report that a Dallas policeman had been killed by the fusillade from an assassin. It had been reported from Dallas that a policeman and a Secret Service man had been shot and killed some distance from the scene of the attack on the president. The Assistant Secretary, who had worked for Mr. Kennedy in the Senate, is in charge of Secret Service policy and advises on fiscal matters. Now, just a little while before he was assassinated, Mrs. Kennedy turned to her husband and said, "You can't say Dallas wasn't friendly to you." Mrs. John Connolly, wife of the wounded Texas governor, said that Mrs. Kennedy turned to her husband and made that remark as they rode past cheering crowds in Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy, wearing a stunning pink wool suit and matching pink pillbox hat, had a bunch of yellow roses with her in the open-top limousine. They had been presented to her at the Dallas airport. So the roses remained in the blood-spattered car outside the hospital where her husband was at that time dying. She clutched her husband to her as he slumped forward in the seat of the car. She knelt on the floor over him during the high-speed ride to Parkland Hospital's emergency ward. Mrs. Kennedy helped lift her dying husband onto a stretcher. She was taken inside the hospital and whisked from view. She appeared stunned as she entered the hospital. Physicians attending the president said they did not take time to notice whether she or any members of the White House staff were with the president at the precise moment of his death. Members of the White House party said Mrs. Kennedy's first thought then was to be with her children, Caroline, 6, and John Jr., who will be 3 next week, and who, at last report, were at the White House in Washington. Mrs. Kennedy was taken to Love Field in Dallas, and there, on the plane that carried her to what had been a personal triumph for her in Texas, she joined witnesses as Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn into office as Chief Executive of the United States. The casket of her husband was placed aboard the plane. Mrs. Johnson, the new First Lady, embraced Mrs. Kennedy, and she rode back to the Capitol with the new president. We are going to return you to WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, and Charles Murphy with some film that was made at the hospital where the president died. So to WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, and Charles Murphy.
Late films have arrived in our newsroom from Dallas showing the scenes of horror and disbelief outside Parkland Hospital. Newsmen hurry to the emergency room. The president's wife arrives, stunned. This is Mrs. Kennedy, in the middle. At this point, no one knew rather, whether the president was alive or dead. Mrs. Kennedy conferring with a Dallas policeman who had sped the president to the hospital and into the emergency room goes Mrs. Kennedy. A corsage of roses lies inside the car in which President Kennedy was shot. A stunned Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth tells what he saw from a few cars back. The disbelief registered on every face. These films from outside the emergency room of Parkland Hospital in Dallas as the president is dying inside. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who saw the shooting, said he heard shots and then saw a Secret Service man pound his fist against a rear fender of the presidential car in anguish. 2 priests arrived to administer last rites. Their names are not yet known. The deed still is not registered with many outside the hospital. And the horror begins to sink in. We'll be back with more films from Dallas as soon as they arrive. Charles Murphy, WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas.
There is this reaction to the death of President Kennedy from French President Charles de Gaulle, who said President Kennedy died like a soldier under fire for his duty and in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, ever the friend of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory. There is also reaction from Canada, our neighbor to the north, and we have that report as recorded in this conversation with our NBC correspondent, Leif Eade, in Ottawa.
A deeply shaken Prime Minister Lester Pearson announced the news of President Kennedy's death to Canada's House of Commons. An aide walked to his front bench shortly